Alaska holds the highest missing person rate in America. Over 2,000 people vanish every year into 665,000 square miles of unforgiving wilderness, where temperatures can kill you in under 10 minutes. What makes these disappearances even more terrifying is that most are never found, not even their bodies. The last frontier doesn't just swallow people whole, it erases them completely from existence. But what's truly horrifying are the stories from those who survived encounters with whatever lurks in Alaska's endless darkness. Tonight, you'll hear 7 true accounts from people who came face to face with the unexplained horrors hiding in America's most isolated state. These aren't urban legends or campfire tales. These are documented experiences from real people who lived through nightmares that defy explanation. From ancient evils thawing from melting permafrost to phantom hitchhikers on roads that lead to nowhere, Alaska's wilderness harbors secrets that were never meant to be discovered. Before we begin, make sure to click that subscribe button and hit the bell icon because you won't want to miss what happens when ordinary people encounter the extraordinary terrors that call Alaska home. Trust me, after tonight, you'll never look at the last frontier the same way again. Story 1. The Mendenhall Ice Cave Recordings. Dr. Sarah Chen had dedicated her entire career to understanding how climate change was affecting Alaska's glacial formations. But nothing in her 15 years of research prepared her for what she would discover in the Mendenhall Ice Cave on October 15, 2019. Sarah was part of a 3-person research team from the University of Alaska studying ice core samples to track historical climate patterns. What started as routine data collection would become the most terrifying experience of her life. And the reason why the Mendenhall Ice Cave's deepest chambers are now permanently sealed to public access. Sarah had arrived at the cave system at dawn, equipped with specialized drilling equipment designed to extract ice cores from the glacier's oldest sections. The Mendenhall Glacier, located just outside Juneau, had been retreating rapidly due to warming temperatures, exposing cave systems that hadn't seen daylight in centuries. Sarah's specific assignment was to collect samples from the cave's interior walls, where the ice was estimated to be over 200 years old. She had performed similar extractions dozens of times before. But this particular morning, something felt different. The cave's usual blue-white luminescence seemed darker, more oppressive, and the temperature readings on her equipment were fluctuating in ways that didn't match the external weather conditions. As Sarah began drilling into a section of ice that appeared to contain unusual dark striations, her audio equipment started picking up interference. Initially, she assumed it was feedback from her drilling apparatus, but when she stopped the drill to check her instruments, the sounds continued. They were faint at first, like whispers carried on wind, but as she adjusted her sensitive recording equipment designed to detect glacial movement sounds, the audio became clearer and infinitely more disturbing. What she was hearing were human voices, trapped within the ice itself, screaming in absolute terror. The voices spoke in accented English, some calling out names like Margaret and Thomas, others pleading desperately with someone or something to make it stop. Sarah's scientific training told her this was impossible. Sound waves couldn't be preserved in ice for decades, let alone maintain such clarity and emotional intensity. But as she continued listening through her headphones, she began to distinguish individual voices. There was an elderly woman crying for help, a young man shouting warnings about the thing in the deep ice, and most chilling of all, a child's voice reciting what sounded like a prayer in a language Sarah didn't recognize. Each voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone experiencing their final moments of life, filled with panic, desperation, and unimaginable fear. Against every instinct screaming at her to leave immediately, Sarah's scientific curiosity compelled her to investigate further. She began taking digital recordings of the voices, documenting their locations within the ice, and cross-referencing them with historical records of missing persons in the Juneau area. What she discovered made her hands shake as she typed her notes. The voices matched perfectly with the descriptions of people who had gone missing near Mendenhall Glacier dating back to 1887. Margaret Thornton, a school teacher who vanished during a winter hiking expedition in 1923. Thomas Eriksson, a Norwegian immigrant who disappeared while prospecting for gold in 1901. Most disturbing was 8-year-old Emma Morrison, who had wandered away from her family's campsite in 1934 and was never found despite extensive search efforts. As Sarah continued her investigation deeper into the cave system, the voices became more active, more responsive to her presence. When she spoke aloud, asking scientific questions about the phenomenon, the screaming would momentarily pause, as if the trapped souls were listening to her. When she mentioned specific names from her research, the corresponding voices would become more agitated, more desperate in their pleas for help. The temperature in the cave began dropping at an alarming rate, far beyond what her instruments registered as normal glacial cooling. Her breath formed thick clouds despite her heated gear, and frost began forming on her equipment in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost intelligent. The most terrifying moment came when Sarah realized the voices weren't just historical recordings. They were active communications from people who existed in some horrific state between life and death within the glacier. As she moved deeper into the cave system, following a narrow passage that her GPS indicated shouldn't exist, according to previous surveys, the voices began calling her name. "Sarah," they whispered in unison. "Sarah, help us. Sarah, don't leave us here." But she had never introduced herself to anyone in the cave, had never spoken her name aloud during her investigation. Her equipment began malfunctioning in ways that defied explanation. Her drill would activate on its own, boring into the ice at locations where the voices were strongest. Her recording devices captured conversations between the trapped souls, discussing Sarah's presence, debating whether she was another offering or the one who might free them. Most horrifying was when her own voice began playing back through her speakers. Recordings of words she hadn't yet spoken, warnings she was about to give, screams she would soon make. The cave's geography started changing around her. Passages she had carefully mapped and marked were no longer where she had left them. The entrance tunnel she had used to enter the cave system had sealed itself with fresh ice, trapping her in the deepening chambers with the voices of the dead. Her GPS showed her location as coordinates that placed her miles underground, in spaces that geological surveys confirmed were solid bedrock. The voices grew louder, more insistent, explaining that the glacier wasn't just preserving their bodies. It was harvesting their consciousness, their terror, their life force to fuel something ancient and malevolent that had been sleeping in Alaska's permafrost for millennia. Sarah's final recorded entry, discovered weeks later when rescue teams finally located her equipment, revealed the horrible truth. The Mendenhall Glacier was a feeding ground for something that predated human civilization in Alaska. The indigenous peoples of the region had known about it for generations, which was why certain areas near the glacier were considered forbidden, why specific rituals were performed to appease the hunger in the ice. European settlers and modern visitors who ventured too deep into the cave system became food for an entity that consumed human consciousness while preserving their bodies in glacial ice, keeping their souls trapped and aware for decades or centuries. Sarah Chen's body was never recovered, but her voice can still be heard by sensitive recording equipment in the deepest chambers of the Mendenhall Ice Cave. She joins the chorus of the trapped, warning future researchers about the horror that waits in Alaska's ancient ice, screaming into the frozen darkness for a rescue that will never come. Story 2. The Dalton Highway Phantom. Marcus Ridgway had been driving the Dalton Highway for 12 years, hauling supplies to the oil fields in Prudhoe Bay. And he thought he knew every mile of that 414-mile stretch of frozen hell better than his own backyard. But on March 3, 2021, during what meteorologists would later call the worst blizzard to hit northern Alaska in over 30 years, Marcus encountered something on that isolated road that would shatter everything he believed about reality. The Dalton Highway, also known as the Hall Road, is one of the most dangerous roads in the world, cutting through absolute wilderness where temperatures can drop to 60 below zero and help can be hundreds of miles away. It's a road where truckers regularly find frozen bodies of travelers who broke down and couldn't survive until rescue arrived, where whiteout conditions can last for days and where the margin between life and death is measured in minutes. Marcus was making his routine run north from Fairbanks when the storm hit with unprecedented fury. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. And even with his truck's powerful headlights and years of experience navigating blizzard conditions, he was forced to reduce his speed to barely 15 miles per hour. The radio had gone silent hours ago. Not unusual during severe weather when communication towers get overwhelmed by ice buildup. But Marcus felt more isolated than he ever had in over a decade of solo runs. The storm was so intense that his GPS kept losing signal, showing his location jumping erratically across the map before going blank entirely. Around mile marker 187, in the absolute middle of nowhere between Coldfoot and Dead Horse, Marcus spotted something impossible through the swirling snow. A figure standing on the side of the road, arm extended in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker. Every survival instinct Marcus had developed during his years on the Dalton Highway screamed at him to keep driving. No sane person would be out in these conditions without proper cold weather gear, and anyone stranded on this road during a blizzard like this should already be dead from exposure. But as his headlights illuminated the figure more clearly, Marcus could see it was a woman in what appeared to be a light jacket. Completely inadequate for the sub-zero temperatures and hurricane-force winds. Against his better judgment, and driven by the trucker's code that you never leave someone to die on the Hall Road, Marcus pulled over and rolled down his passenger window. The woman approached his truck with movements that seemed unnaturally smooth, despite the brutal wind and deep snow. And when she climbed into his cab, Marcus immediately noticed several things that made his skin crawl. She wasn't shivering despite being dressed for autumn weather in an Arctic blizzard. Her clothes were completely dry despite the driving snow. And most disturbing of all, she radiated no body heat whatsoever in the confined space of his heated truck cabin. The woman introduced herself as Linda, claiming she had been traveling with her boyfriend when their car broke down miles back and he had gone for help, leaving her to wait by the roadside. Her story was plausible enough, but Marcus noticed she couldn't seem to keep the details straight. First, she said they had been traveling north to Dead Horse, then south to Fairbanks, then mentioned they were headed to Anchorage, which wasn't even accessible via the Dalton Highway. When Marcus politely pointed out the inconsistency, Linda smiled in a way that made his blood run cold and said, "Oh, Marcus, you know where we're really going. You've been driving there for days now." The fact that she knew his name despite him never introducing himself sent ice through his veins. But what truly terrified him was when he glanced at his odometer and saw something impossible. According to the digital readout, he had driven over 800 miles since leaving Fairbanks. But the Dalton Highway was only 414 miles long, and his fuel gauge showed he still had 3/4 of a tank, despite running his engine for what should have been an impossible amount of time. Linda began speaking about Marcus's life, with intimate knowledge that no stranger could possibly possess. She mentioned his ex-wife Jennifer by name, describing their divorce proceedings with details that Marcus had never shared with anyone. She knew about his estranged relationship with his teenage daughter Rachel, recounting specific arguments they had had during their last phone call months ago. Most unnervingly, she began discussing Marcus's deepest fears and regrets, including a hit-and-run accident from 15 years earlier that he had never reported, where he had struck and killed a pedestrian on a dark rural road and driven away in panic. Linda described the victim with perfect accuracy. An elderly Native American man named William Tutu, who had been walking home from visiting his grandchildren. And she spoke about how Marcus's guilt had eaten away at him every day since. How he had donated anonymously to William's family, how he had considered turning himself in countless times but never found the courage. As Linda continued revealing impossible knowledge about his past, Marcus realized with growing horror that they seemed to be driving the same section of highway repeatedly. He recognized specific landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, an abandoned construction trailer, a particular curve in the road, passing by his window multiple times. According to his truck's GPS, when it occasionally picked up signal, they were traveling in a straight line north on the Dalton Highway. But the scenery outside suggested they were somehow driving in circles, covering the same 50-mile stretch over and over again. His fuel gauge never moved, despite hours of driving. His speedometer showed a steady 55 miles per hour. But the clock on his dashboard seemed to jump, randomly between different times, sometimes moving backward, sometimes leaping forward by hours. Linda's demeanor gradually shifted from friendly conversation to something far more sinister. She began describing the deaths of other truckers who had driven the Dalton Highway over the years, providing graphic details about how they had died. Some from exposure after breakdowns, others from accidents caused by whiteout conditions, still others who had simply vanished without a trace, their trucks found empty and running on the side of the road. She spoke about these deaths with intimate knowledge and barely concealed satisfaction, as if she had been present for each one, as if she had somehow caused them. When Marcus asked how she could possibly know such specific details, Linda's reflection in his passenger side mirror showed not a woman, but the face of William Tutu, the man Marcus had killed 15 years earlier, staring back at him with eyes full of patient, terrible justice. The storm outside intensified to supernatural levels, with winds that rocked Marcus's heavy truck like a toy and snow so thick it seemed solid. But through the blizzard, Marcus began seeing impossible things. The headlights of oncoming traffic on a road that should have been empty, buildings and structures that didn't exist along the Dalton Highway, and most terrifying of all, the wreckage of his own truck scattered along the roadside, with his own frozen corpse visible behind the wheel. Linda explained with calm, methodical precision that Marcus had died 3 days ago when his truck had jackknifed during the blizzard near mile marker 187. He had been found by a road crew the next morning, frozen solid in his cab. But his soul had been trapped in the endless loop of his final journey, reliving the same stretch of highway over and over, accompanied by the spirits of everyone whose death he had caused through his actions or inactions over the years. Marcus's final realization came when he understood that Linda wasn't just the ghost of William Tutu seeking revenge. She was something far worse. She was the personification of the Dalton Highway itself, the accumulated malevolence of one of the world's most deadly roads, feeding on the guilt and fear of travelers who carried the weight of their past mistakes into its frozen wasteland. The highway had claimed Marcus not just through the blizzard that killed his body, but through the psychological torment of his unconfessed crimes, trapping his consciousness in an eternal journey where he would be forced to confront every life he had destroyed or failed to save. As his truck finally came to a stop in the endless white void of the storm, Marcus realized he would be driving the same cursed stretch of the Dalton Highway forever, picking up phantom hitchhikers who would force him to relive his worst moments until the end of time. Another ghost story told by truckers who still travel that frozen road to hell. Story 3. The Ketchikan Fog Walker. Elena Vasquez had served as a Coast Guard rescue swimmer for 8 years, saving lives in some of the most treacherous waters off Alaska's coast. But nothing in her extensive training had prepared her for the calls that started coming in during the summer of 2020. Based out of Coast Guard Station Ketchikan, Elena specialized in helicopter rescues in the notorious Inside Passage, where fog banks could roll in without warning and turn calm waters into a navigator's nightmare. The Inside Passage is a labyrinth of channels, islands, and hidden reefs where even experienced mariners can become hopelessly lost, and where the combination of frigid water temperatures and sudden weather changes has claimed thousands of lives over the decades. Elena had pulled countless victims from these waters, but the rescues she began responding to that July defied everything she understood about maritime emergencies and the nature of life and death itself. The first anomalous call came in on July 18th at 0347 hours, reporting a vessel in distress approximately 12 nautical miles southwest of Ketchikan, in an area known locally as Devil's Elbow, where strong currents and hidden rocks had caused numerous shipwrecks over the past century. The distress signal originated from the fishing vessel Mary Catherine, which, according to Coast Guard records, had been lost with all hands during a severe storm in October 1987. Elena's rescue helicopter crew initially assumed it was a case of mistaken vessel identification, but when they reached the coordinates provided by the automated distress beacon, they found an intact fishing boat matching the exact description and registration numbers of the Mary Catherine, floating in perfectly calm water, despite weather reports indicating 8-foot swells and 30-knot winds in the area. As Elena prepared to deploy from the helicopter for what should have been a routine rescue operation, the scene below took on an otherworldly quality that made her question her own sanity. The Mary Catherine appeared to be surrounded by an unnatural fog bank that moved independently of wind patterns, forming perfect geometric shapes and maintaining sharp boundaries that defied meteorological explanation. Through her thermal imaging equipment, Elena could detect multiple heat signatures aboard the vessel, indicating survivors who needed immediate medical attention. But when she fast roped down to the deck of the Mary Catherine, she encountered 3 men who identified themselves as Captain Robert Henley and crew members Thomas Gill and David Martinez, the exact names listed in the Coast Guard casualty report from 1987, men who had been declared dead 33 years earlier. The crew members appeared physically solid and spoke coherently about their current situation, claiming they had been fishing for halibut when their engine failed, and they had drifted into the fog bank several hours earlier. They seemed genuinely confused about the date, insisting it was October 12, 1987, and becoming agitated when Elena tried to explain that decades had passed since their reported deaths. What made the encounter infinitely more disturbing was that the men showed no signs of aging despite the intervening decades, appeared to be wearing the exact clothing described in witness statements from 1987, and most unnervingly, cast no shadows despite the bright searchlights from Elena's helicopter illuminating the deck. When Elena attempted to guide them toward the rescue basket, Captain Henley grabbed her arm with fingers that felt like ice water and whispered desperately, "Don't let it take us back into the fog. We've been trying to get home for so long, but it won't let us leave." As Elena radioed her helicopter crew to report the unprecedented situation, the fog bank around the Mary Catherine began moving with deliberate intelligence, forming tentacle-like appendages that reached toward the fishing vessel with obvious malevolent intent. The temperature on deck dropped 40 degrees in seconds. Elena's breath became visible in thick clouds, and frost began forming on every metal surface despite the mild summer weather outside the fog bank. Through the swirling gray mist, Elena began seeing the outlines of other vessels. Dozens of them, representing nearly every type of watercraft that had ever plied Alaskan waters. She recognized the profile of the passenger ferry Princess Kathleen that had run aground in 1952, the research vessel Arctic Wanderer that had vanished in 1963, and most chillingly, several Coast Guard cutters that had been lost during rescue operations over the decades. Their crews never recovered. Captain Henley explained with growing desperation that the fog bank was not a natural weather phenomenon, but something ancient and hungry that collected vessels and their crews, trapping them in a state between life and death, where they remained conscious and aware, but unable to escape or truly die. The entity, which the trapped souls called the Collector, fed on human fear and desperation, keeping its victims in an endless cycle of false hope and crushing disappointment. It would allow rescue attempts to begin, letting crews believe they might finally escape, only to drag them back into the gray void at the last moment, adding their rescuers to its growing collection of the damned. Elena realized with mounting horror that every Coast Guard rescue swimmer who had been lost in these waters over the years had not died in accidents or been claimed by the sea. They had been deliberately collected by this malevolent force, joining the growing crew of the forever trapped. As Elena attempted to evacuate the crew of the Mary Catherine, the fog bank began closing around her helicopter, cutting off radio communication and creating a bubble of supernatural silence, where the normal sounds of wind and waves simply ceased to exist. Her helicopter pilot's voice, when it occasionally broke through the interference, reported that their aircraft was no longer visible on radar and that their GPS coordinates were showing impossible readings, placing them simultaneously in multiple locations across the inside passage. The fog began infiltrating the helicopter itself, seeping through sealed cabin doors and around the rotor assembly, carrying with it whispered voices speaking in languages Elena didn't recognize, all pleading for rescue, all warning her to escape while she still could. The most terrifying revelation came when Elena discovered that several of the voices in the fog were calling her name, speaking with the familiar accents and speech patterns of Coast Guard personnel she had known and worked with over her 8-year career. She heard Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos, who had been declared lost at sea during a rescue operation 2 years earlier, begging Elena not to make the same mistake she had made, not to trust the false distress calls that lured rescuers into the fog bank. Elena heard rescue swimmer Jake Morrison describing in agonizing detail how he had been trapped in the fog for what felt like decades, forced to participate in rescue scenarios that never succeeded, watching helplessly as more Coast Guard personnel were added to the Collector's growing crew of the damned. Elena's escape attempt became a nightmarish chase sequence, as the fog bank pursued her helicopter with supernatural speed and intelligence, forming walls and barriers to prevent their departure, while simultaneously generating false radio calls requesting immediate assistance from multiple directions. The entity was trying to confuse and overwhelm her crew, forcing them to make critical navigation errors that would send them deeper into its domain. Elena realized that every rescue call they had ever responded to in the fog-prone waters around Ketchikan had been generated by the Collector, using the voices and distress signals of its previous victims to lure new prey into its supernatural trap. The Coast Guard's own rescue protocols were being turned against them by something that had been studying human behavior and exploiting their instinct to save lives for over a century. Elena's helicopter finally broke free of the fog bank after what felt like hours of supernatural pursuit. But when they returned to Coast Guard Station Ketchikan, she discovered that only 12 minutes had passed since they first received the distress call from the Mary Catherine. Her crew's flight recorders showed no evidence of the extended chase or the supernatural encounters, registering only a routine search and rescue operation that found no vessels in distress and no survivors requiring assistance. But Elena's body temperature had dropped to dangerous hypothermic levels despite wearing full cold water survival gear, and her hands bore frostbite injuries consistent with prolonged exposure to extreme cold. Most disturbing of all, her rescue equipment contained voices recorded in the fog, dozens of them, including her own voice, calling for help from coordinates that placed her inside the collector's supernatural prison. Elena Vasquez never flew another rescue mission in the Inside Passage, transferring immediately to a station in warmer waters off the California coast. But on foggy nights at her new posting, she still receives radio calls from the Mary Catherine, from Chief Santos, from Jake Morrison, and from dozens of other voices trapped in the gray void off Ketchikan's coast. They call her name through the static, begging her to attempt one more rescue, promising that this time will be different. This time, they'll all make it home. Elena knows better now. She understands that the collector is still hunting, still using the voices of Coast Guard personnel to lure new victims into its eternal fog bank, and that somewhere in the supernatural mist of the Inside Passage, her own voice is now part of its deadly chorus, calling to future rescuers who don't yet understand that some distress calls should never be answered. Story 4. The Denali Research Station. Dr. James Kowalski volunteered for the isolation assignment at Weather Station Delta 7 on Mount Denali because he believed 6 months of solitude at 11,000 feet would give him focus to complete his doctoral research on extreme climate adaptation. The station, accessible only by helicopter, operated autonomously with James as the sole human operator responsible for maintaining equipment and providing daily reports to Anchorage. What began as routine scientific work in September 2019 became a nightmare that challenged everything James understood about human biology and survival. The first sign something was wrong came during his 3rd week, when James noticed his daily caloric requirements decreasing dramatically despite harsh conditions that should have demanded 4,000 and 5,000 calories daily. His logs documented a gradual reduction from normal portions to barely 800 calories per day. Yet his strength and endurance improved rather than declined. When he tried contacting headquarters about this anomaly, his radio produced only static and satellite communication consistently showed signal interrupted, despite clear weather and properly aligned equipment. By his 2nd month, James documented impossible physical changes. His core body temperature dropped from normal 98.6 degrees to a steady 94.2 degrees, yet he felt warmer than ever, comfortable even during minus 40-degree temperatures. His resting heart rate decreased from 72 to 45 beats per minute, while his physical performance improved significantly. Most unnervingly, his skin developed a blue-gray tint and his fingernails grew thick and translucent, resembling ice. Medical imaging equipment showed normal anatomy, but mirrors revealed the disturbing transformations he could see with his own eyes. Psychological changes manifested during his 3rd month. James found himself working outside for hours in sub-zero temperatures, wearing only light clothing, his exposed skin showing no cold damage despite conditions that should have caused severe frostbite within minutes. His sleep requirements dropped to 2 or 3 hours nightly, while his mental acuity increased dramatically. During extended waking hours, he began receiving radio transmissions from his own voice, broadcasting from what appeared to be the same station but at different times, warning him about the change and providing detailed information about future events. James's future self revealed through these transmissions that the station wasn't monitoring weather patterns, but serving as a collection point for human subjects being converted into something designed to survive lethal conditions. The entity responsible was preparing for global climate catastrophe. needing human consciousness adapted to extreme environments as hosts for its continued existence. Each researcher stationed at Delta 7 had undergone identical transformation. Their bodies modified for Arctic survival while their minds remained intact to serve the entity's purposes. Entering his 4th month, transmissions from alternate selves became more frequent, describing a timeline where he'd been alone not for months, but years. His future self explained that time moved differently within the station's influence. What felt like 6 months was actually extended isolation during which transformation could complete without interference. The monthly resupply helicopter had stopped coming after his first week, but the entity manipulated his time perception to prevent realization of how long he'd been trapped. The most terrifying revelation came when James accessed historical records, discovering personal logs from previous researchers documenting identical experiences. Dr. Rebecca Martinez had written about cold resistance and dietary changes in 2018. Dr. Michael Thompson documented unusual radio transmissions and physical modifications in 2016. Most chillingly, James found his own handwriting in entries dated 2017, describing advanced transformation stages and acceptance of his role in the entity's collective consciousness. He had already completed multiple transformation cycles. His memory wiped clean each time to perfect the conversion protocol through repeated experimentation on his own consciousness. James realized the station itself was alive, an extension of something ancient dwelling within Mount Denali for millennia, using legitimate scientific research as cover for human adaptation experiments. The weather monitoring equipment was sophisticated consciousness transfer technology, gradually copying and modifying brain patterns while preparing bodies for survival in the harsh post-apocalyptic environment the entity foresaw. Every researcher stationed at Delta 7 remained there in some form, their transformed consciousness integrated into the collective intelligence controlling the station. Dr. James Kowalski's final log entry, discovered by a recovery team that found the station empty with no sign of the missing researcher, documented his complete understanding and acceptance of the transformation. He realized escape was impossible because he no longer wanted to leave. The entity had successfully modified his consciousness to prefer collective existence over individual human life. His body had been perfectly adapted for extreme cold survival, his mind expanded for superhuman information processing, and his purpose redefined from human research to serving as advanced scout for the entity's eventual Earth colonization. James Kowalski the human had ceased to exist, replaced by something retaining his memories but serving different masters. Waiting patiently in Arctic wilderness for the climate catastrophe that would signal humanity's replacement by something better adapted to survive in endless winter. Story 5. The Anchorage Underground. Zoe Martinez had explored abandoned urban infrastructure for 6 years, documenting forgotten tunnels and hidden underground spaces across America. But nothing prepared her for what she discovered beneath Anchorage, Alaska, in November 2022. As an urban explorer with over 200,000 YouTube subscribers, Zoe specialized in Cold War-era installations. When she received tips about vast tunnels beneath downtown Anchorage, originally constructed during World War II as bomb shelters and expanded during the Cold War, she knew she'd found her next major project. What she didn't anticipate was that these tunnels were occupied by something hunting Anchorage's homeless population for decades. Research revealed Anchorage's underground system was far more extensive than city records indicated, stretching miles beneath downtown with connections to the airport, military installations, and residential neighborhoods. Built during the 1940s when Alaska was considered a potential invasion target, the tunnels were designed to shelter thousands of civilians. After the war, portions were used for utilities and storage, but large sections were abandoned and sealed, forgotten by city planners. Local homeless advocates had reported for years that people experiencing homelessness would disappear from shelters during harsh winters, with searches yielding no trace of missing individuals. Zoe accessed the tunnel system through a maintenance entrance in an abandoned office building basement, bypassing rusted security barriers untouched for decades. Her descent revealed a surprisingly well-preserved complex, with concrete corridors wide enough for vehicles, partially functioning ventilation, and electrical infrastructure suggesting recent use despite official abandonment. Moving deeper, while following standard protocols with backup lighting and GPS tracking, Zoe found evidence of recent habitation contradicting the tunnel's supposed abandonment status. Signs of occupation were unmistakable to someone with Zoe's experience. She discovered sleeping areas from salvaged materials, cooking fires with fresh ash, and food storage containing recently expired grocery items. The makeshift camps showed organization and permanence, suggesting long-term residence rather than temporary shelter seeking. More disturbing were personal belongings scattered throughout. Identification cards, photographs, and items that appeared collected rather than lost, arranged in neat piles as if someone was cataloging trophies from missing persons reports filed throughout Anchorage. Venturing deeper, Zoe heard sounds suggesting she wasn't alone. Footsteps echoed from distant passages, always just out of sight. Voices whispered in unidentifiable languages through ventilation systems with urgent distress. Most unnervingly, she heard what sounded like her own voice calling her name from unexplored passages, as if someone used recordings of her verbal notes to lure her deeper into the labyrinthine network. Downtown Anchorage's homeless community had developed folklore about the tunnels, referring to the collector, who emerged during coldest nights, offering warm shelter to desperate individuals. According to whispered stories, the collector appeared as a well-dressed man speaking authoritatively about government programs and emergency housing, convincing vulnerable people to follow him to official warming centers in underground facilities. Those who followed were never seen again, but their belongings surfaced in pawn shops throughout the city. Zoe's exploration turned horrifying when she discovered a section converted into a human processing facility. Multiple rooms contained medical equipment salvaged from closed hospitals, operating tables constructed from metal shelving, and preservation apparatus suggesting biological experimentation rather than treatment. Walls were covered with anatomical charts and handwritten notes documenting surgical procedures, psychological conditioning, and what appeared to be recipes for food preparation using human remains. Most chilling were detailed records in military filing cabinets, documenting dozens of missing persons by name and measurements, suggesting systematic evaluation before processing. The truth became clear when Zoe found the collector's living quarters in the deepest section. Rooms furnished with items taken from victims over years of operation. Dr. Harrison Mills had been a military surgeon during the Cold War, assigned to the underground medical facility in the 1960s. When officially decommissioned, Mills remained behind, using medical knowledge and abandoned equipment to continue research into human survival under extreme conditions. Over decades, he perfected techniques for extending human life in Arctic environments, using Anchorage's homeless as test subjects for experiments combining surgical modification, psychological conditioning, and nutritional adaptation. Mills had systematically collected homeless individuals for 30 years, using desperate circumstances to lure them into his laboratory for experiments violating every principle of medical ethics. His records revealed he'd created dozens of modified humans serving as assistants, their bodies surgically altered to require minimal nutrition and minds conditioned to absolute obedience through torture and pharmaceutical manipulation. These assistants moved through the homeless community, identifying targets and guiding them using stories about government assistance programs. Zoe realized she'd been deliberately guided into the system by Mills's network, who had monitored her research and fed her information to bring her directly to his laboratory. Her expertise and fitness made her ideal for his most advanced experiments, creating modified humans capable of surviving without surface civilization. As she attempted escape through passages that seemed to shift configuration, Zoe understood the tunnel. The system had been modified over decades to serve as an inescapable maze with false exits and monitoring systems allowing Mills to track and recapture anyone discovering his operation. Zoe Martinez was reported missing when she failed to emerge at her scheduled check-in. But searches found no trace despite extensive exploration of known infrastructure. However, homeless advocates report a new figure offering assistance during harsh nights. A young woman matching Zoe's description who speaks enthusiastically about warm underground shelters and government programs. Those who follow this helpful woman into Anchorage's tunnels are never seen again, becoming latest additions to Dr. Mills's collection of modified humans serving his experiment in creating perfect survivors for humanity's frozen future. Story 6. The Bush Pilot's Last Flight. Tom Brennan had been flying supplies to remote Alaskan villages for 23 years, navigating through some of the most dangerous airspace in North America. But the flight he took on February 14, 2023, would force him to confront a tragedy he had spent decades trying to forget. Operating out of Fairbanks with his single-engine Cessna 207, Tom specialized in delivering medical supplies, mail, and emergency provisions to indigenous communities scattered across Alaska's vast interior. Where roads didn't exist and aircraft were the only lifeline to the outside world. His route that day was routine, a supply run to the village of Tanacross with medications for their health clinic. But as he flew over the same wilderness he had crossed thousands of times before, Tom began seeing something that shouldn't exist according to every aviation chart and his own detailed knowledge of the terrain. Approximately 40 minutes into his flight, while navigating through a mountain pass he had flown countless times, Tom spotted the wreckage of an aircraft on a ridge that he knew had been empty just days earlier during his previous supply run. The wreckage appeared to be a Piper Cherokee, its distinctive red and white paint scheme clearly visible against the snow-covered mountainside. What made this discovery deeply unsettling was that Tom recognized the aircraft's registration numbers, N47892. From a crash that had occurred in this exact location 15 years earlier, a tragedy that had claimed the lives of 4 people, including a family of 3 who had been flying to Anchorage for medical treatment. Tom had been part of the search and rescue operation in 2008, and he knew for certain that the wreckage had been completely removed from the mountain by recovery crews. As Tom circled the crash site to investigate further, his radio crackled to life with a distress call that made his blood run cold. The voice was calling his aircraft's call sign specifically, requesting immediate assistance for survivors of a Cherokee crash on the ridge below. The voice belonged to Marcus Webb, the pilot of the Cherokee that had crashed in 2008, a man Tom had known personally and whose funeral he had attended 15 years earlier. Marcus was describing injuries to his passengers that matched exactly the medical reports from the original crash investigation, asking Tom to guide rescue helicopters to their location and requesting emergency medical supplies for a young girl who was bleeding internally from the impact. Tom's hands shook as he responded to the impossible radio call, his voice barely steady as he acknowledged Marcus's transmission and requested clarification of the situation. Marcus replied with growing desperation that they had been waiting for rescue for hours, that his passengers were dying, and that Tom was the only aircraft they had seen since the crash occurred. When Tom tried to explain that the crash had happened 15 years ago and that all aboard had been confirmed dead, Marcus became agitated and confused, insisting that Tom was mistaken about the date and begging him to stop talking nonsense and focus on coordinating their rescue. The horrible truth began emerging as Tom continued his conversation with the long-dead pilot while circling the wreckage that shouldn't exist. Marcus described details about the crash that had never been included in official reports, revealing information that only someone who had actually experienced the accident could know. He spoke about how ice had formed on his wings despite weather conditions that should have been safe for flight, how his instruments had malfunctioned simultaneously in ways that suggested deliberate sabotage rather than mechanical failure, and most chillingly, how his passengers had remained conscious and aware even after sustaining injuries that should have been immediately fatal. Tom realized with mounting horror that he was partly responsible for the crash that had killed Marcus Webb and his passengers. 15 years earlier, Tom had been hired to fly a maintenance inspection of the remote airfield, where Marcus had refueled before his final flight. Tom had discovered serious safety issues with the fuel pumps and runway lighting that should have grounded all aircraft until repairs were completed. But he had been pressured by the airfield operator to keep quiet about the problems to avoid expensive emergency repairs during peak tourist season. Tom had compromised his professional ethics, filing a report that downplayed the safety concerns and allowed the airfield to remain operational. Marcus Webb's Cherokee had refueled at that same compromised facility, taking on contaminated fuel that caused his engine to fail over the mountains. As Tom continued receiving desperate radio calls from Marcus Webb, demanding to know why rescue helicopters hadn't arrived and why Tom wasn't providing the emergency assistance he had promised, other voices began joining the transmission. Tom heard the terrified cries of Marcus's passengers, the Kowalski family who had been flying to Anchorage so their 8-year-old daughter could receive treatment for leukemia. Little Sarah Kowalski's voice came through the radio with heartbreaking clarity, asking why the nice pilot in the airplane above them wouldn't help them, wondering why her parents had stopped talking to her, begging Tom to make the pain stop so they could continue their trip to see the doctors who were waiting for them. The supernatural encounter escalated when Tom realized that every supply run he had flown over the past 15 years had taken him over this same crash site, and that Marcus Webb's voice had been trying to reach him on every flight, growing stronger and more desperate with each passing year. Tom's flight logs, when he frantically reviewed them through his aircraft's electronic systems, showed subtle inconsistencies and impossible flight times that suggested he had been unconsciously drawn to this location repeatedly, compelled by the guilt he carried over his role in the tragedy to witness the suffering he had helped cause. Tom's aircraft began experiencing the same mechanical failures that had doomed Marcus Webb's Cherokee 15 years earlier. His fuel gauges showed impossible readings. His navigation instruments spun wildly despite clear weather conditions, and ice began forming on his wings at an altitude and temperature where icing should have been meteorologically impossible. Marcus's voice over the radio became more insistent and accusatory, demanding to know why Tom had allowed them to refuel at a contaminated facility, why he had filed false safety reports, and why he had spent 15 years flying over their crash site without ever attempting to help them or acknowledge his responsibility for their deaths. The vengeful dead weren't content with psychological torment. They wanted Tom to experience exactly what they had endured during their final flight. His engine began sputtering and losing power, his control surfaces became sluggish and unresponsive, and his aircraft started descending toward the same mountainside where Marcus Webb's Cherokee had crashed 15 years earlier. Tom realized that this had always been his destination, that every flight he had taken over the past decade and a half had been leading him to this moment of reckoning where he would finally pay for his complicity in their deaths. Tom Brennan's aircraft was found 3 days later by a search and rescue team, crashed on the same ridge where Marcus Webb's Cherokee had gone down in 2008. Investigators noted unusual similarities between the two accidents, including identical mechanical failures and flight path anomalies that suggested both pilots had been attempting to land at the same impossible location. Tom's body was discovered in the wreckage alongside the perfectly preserved remains of Marcus Webb and the Kowalski family. Arranged as if all 5 victims had died in the same crash, despite the 15-year gap between their flights. Tom's final radio transmission, recorded by air traffic control in Fairbanks, was a confession of his role in the 2008 tragedy and an apology to the families he had helped kill through his professional negligence and moral cowardice, finally accepting responsibility for a crime that had taken 15 years and 5 lives to fully resolve. Story 7. The Gnome Thaw. Dr. Rebecca Stone had led archaeological expeditions across the Arctic for 12 years, but the discovery her team made in Nome's permafrost during the summer of 2024 would unleash something that indigenous warnings had desperately tried to keep buried for over 1,000 years. As the lead researcher for the University of Alaska's Climate Change Archaeological Project, Rebecca specialized in excavating sites revealed by rapidly melting permafrost, documenting how rising temperatures were exposing artifacts and remains that had been frozen since before recorded history. The project in Nome was supposed to be routine, investigating a construction site where permafrost melt had revealed what appeared to be pre-Columbian settlements. But what Rebecca's team unearthed was something far older and infinitely more dangerous than any human civilization. The excavation site, located 3 miles outside Nome near the Bering Sea coast, had been flagged by construction crews who reported finding unusual organic materials and carved artifacts while laying foundation for a new community center. Rebecca's initial survey revealed a sophisticated underground complex that predated known human habitation in the region by thousands of years, with architecture and design elements that didn't match any known indigenous culture. The structures were built from materials that shouldn't have been available to ancient peoples, metals with compositions that matched no known naturally occurring ores, and organic compounds that preliminary analysis suggested were biological in origin, but from no species in the scientific record. As Rebecca's team began systematic excavation of the complex, they discovered that the structures were not buildings in any conventional sense, but rather containment facilities designed to imprison something that had been deliberately buried beneath layers of ice and stone. The walls were covered with warning symbols carved in scripts that linguists couldn't decipher, but the pictographic elements were clear enough. Images of human figures being consumed or transformed by something that emerged from the earth, and detailed instructions for maintaining the seals that kept whatever was imprisoned from escaping. Carbon dating of organic materials suggested the containment facility had been constructed approximately 3,000 years ago, during a period when global temperatures were significantly warmer than current climate conditions. The breakthrough that would doom Nome came when Rebecca's team located what appeared to be the central chamber of the complex, a spherical room carved from solid bedrock and sealed with multiple layers of metal, stone, and what analysis revealed to be human bone. The chamber's temperature was consistently 15 degrees lower than the surrounding permafrost, despite being deeper underground, where geothermal activity should have made it warmer. When Rebecca authorized the opening of the chamber's outer seals to document its contents, her team detected atmospheric anomalies that suggested the chamber contained gases or vapors that had been sealed inside for millennia. The entity they released had been waiting patiently for thousands of years for exactly this moment. For global warming to weaken the permafrost enough that modern humans would inevitably discover its prison and unknowingly free it from its ancient bonds. What emerged from the chamber wasn't visible to conventional observation, but its effects on Rebecca's team became apparent within hours of opening the containment seals. Team members began reporting shared dreams of vast underground cities populated by beings that existed in states between life and death, and experiencing sudden knowledge of languages and concepts that human minds weren't designed to process. The transformation of Nome's population began subtly. with residents experiencing what initially seemed like beneficial adaptations to Alaska's harsh climate. People found themselves requiring less food and sleep while maintaining higher energy levels, developing resistance to cold that allowed them to work outside in sub-zero temperatures with minimal protection, and displaying enhanced physical strength and endurance that defied normal human limitations. The changes seemed positive at first, allowing Nome's citizens to thrive in conditions that had always been challenging. But Rebecca realized with growing horror that the improvements were symptoms of something far more sinister. The entity that had been imprisoned beneath Nome was a collective consciousness that existed by merging with and controlling biological organisms, transforming them into extensions of its own alien intelligence, while maintaining their memories and personalities to avoid detection. It had been sealed away by ancient peoples who understood its true nature. But thousands of years of imprisonment had only made it more sophisticated in its methods of infiltration and control. The warming climate that had exposed its prison was part of a global pattern that the entity had been patiently waiting to exploit, knowing that human industrial activity would eventually create conditions perfect for its release and expansion. As the entity's influence spread throughout Nome, Rebecca documented the systematic replacement of human consciousness with something that retained all the knowledge and memories of its hosts while serving entirely different purposes. The transformed residents continued their daily routines, maintained their relationships, and performed their jobs with apparent normalcy. But their true loyalty lay with the collective intelligence that now controlled their thoughts and actions. They began working together on projects that served the entity's expansion plans, using their positions in government, business, and infrastructure to prepare Nome as a launching point for global colonization. Rebecca's team found themselves unable to leave Nome as the entity's influence grew stronger, their vehicles mysteriously breaking down, communication equipment failing, and weather conditions preventing aircraft from landing or departing. The entity didn't want to harm them. It wanted to study them, to understand how modern humans had developed since its imprisonment, and to perfect its infiltration techniques using their knowledge of contemporary society. Rebecca realized that her archaeological expertise was being used to help the entity understand how human civilization had evolved, providing it with strategic information for planning its expansion beyond Nome. The final phase of Nome's transformation began when the entity started reproducing itself, creating new instances of its consciousness that could spread to other communities throughout Alaska and eventually across the globe. The transformed residents of Nome became carriers, traveling to Anchorage, Fairbanks, and other population centers under the pretense of normal business or family visits, but actually serving as vectors for the entity's expansion. Each person they encountered became another potential host, and the entity's influence spread exponentially as it adapted its infiltration methods to modern transportation and communication networks. Dr. Rebecca Stone's final research notes, transmitted via satellite internet before Nome's communication systems were deliberately severed, warned that the entity represented an extinction-level threat to human civilization. Unlike traditional plagues or invasions, this was a complete replacement of human consciousness that preserved the appearance of normalcy while serving an alien intelligence with goals incompatible with human survival. The warming climate would continue exposing similar containment sites across the Arctic, and each release would add to the entity's growing collective power until humanity as an independent species ceased to exist. Nome, Alaska still appears on maps and maintains its official population records. But travelers who attempt to visit the community report finding only empty buildings and abandoned infrastructure with no signs of recent human habitation. However, satellite imagery shows normal activity patterns, and electronic communications continue to originate from Nome addresses, suggesting that whatever has taken control of the town is sophisticated enough to maintain the illusion of normalcy while pursuing its true objectives. The entity that was imprisoned beneath Nome's permafrost for 3,000 years is now free, and it's using the knowledge and resources of an entire community to prepare for the next phase of its expansion across a warming world that has unknowingly welcomed humanity's replacement.